What happens when the most brilliant battlefield commander in your army becomes your most dangerous liability, and firing him might cost you the war, but keeping him might cost you everything else? In the spring of 1943, as Allied forces struggled to gain a foothold in North Africa and the outcome of the Second World War hung in the balance, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced exactly this nightmare scenario with Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., a man whose tactical genius was matched only by his spectacular capacity for self-destruction. The relationship between these two men, forged in the crucible of global conflict, would become one of the most volatile and consequential command relationships in military history, a psychological chess match played out against the backdrop of humanity's deadliest war. Eisenhower, the careful diplomat and organizational mastermind from Abilene, Kansas, had risen through the ranks not by leading charges but by building coalitions, managing egos, and keeping the fractious Allied command structure from tearing itself apart. Patton, by contrast, was a warrior poet who believed he had fought in previous lives as a Roman legionnaire and a Napoleonic cavalry officer, a man who wore ivory-handled revolvers and composed poetry about the glory of battle, who saw war not as a necessary evil but as the ultimate expression of human will and courage. Their partnership was doomed from the start, yet essential to victory, a volatile chemical reaction that Eisenhower had to carefully control without extinguishing the very fire that made Patton invaluable on the battlefield. The tension between them would explode into open confrontation multiple times between 1943 and 1945, threatening to derail the Allied war effort at its most critical junctures and forcing Eisenhower into impossible choices between military necessity and political survival. This is the story of when subordination met insubordination, when genius collided with recklessness, and when the fate of millions rested on one commander's ability to control another commander who believed himself answerable only to destiny and history. If you're fascinated by the untold complexities of wartime leadership and the human dramas that shaped world history, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button right now, because we're going deep into one of World War II's most explosive command relationships, and you'll want to share this story with anyone who thinks they understand what really happened behind the scenes of the Allied victory. Drop a comment below about which aspect of this rivalry surprises you most, or tell us something about Patton or Eisenhower that you didn't know before watching this video, because the layers of this story go deeper than most history books ever reveal. The first seeds of conflict between Eisenhower and Patton were planted long before their wartime confrontations, reaching back to their early careers when both were young officers in a peacetime army that offered little opportunity for advancement or glory. They had known each other since 1919, when both were stationed at Camp Meade in Maryland, both frustrated tankers in an army that saw little future for armored warfare after the First World War had ended. Eisenhower, then a lieutenant colonel being reduced back to captain in the post-war drawdown, had written extensively about tank tactics and the future of mobile warfare, ideas that earned him a reprimand from the infantry branch and nearly ended his career before it truly began. Patton, who had led tanks in combat during the Meuse-Argonne offensive and had been wounded in action, shared Eisenhower's vision of armored warfare but possessed the social connections and family wealth that allowed him to weather the professional storms that nearly sank his colleague. Their early friendship was built on mutual respect and shared frustration with an army that seemed determined to fight the next war exactly like the last one, but even then, fundamental differences in temperament and philosophy created fault lines that would widen under the pressures of actual combat command. Patton saw himself as a warrior aristocrat in the tradition of Alexander and Napoleon, destined for martial glory and unconcerned with the political niceties that constrained lesser men. Eisenhower, despite his folksy Kansas manner, was already revealing himself as a master politician and coalition builder, someone who understood that modern war required not just battlefield victories but the delicate management of Allied relationships, public opinion, and political realities back home. By the time World War II erupted and both men found themselves thrust into positions of immense responsibility, with Eisenhower rising meteorically to Supreme Commander and Patton leading armored divisions in North Africa, their relationship had evolved into something far more complex than simple friendship or professional respect. The first major confrontation came in the aftermath of the Sicily campaign in August 1943, when Patton's shocking behavior threatened to destroy his career and presented Eisenhower with a crisis that could have altered the entire trajectory of the war in Europe. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily, where he encountered Private Charles Herman Kull, a soldier suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder but was then dismissively called battle fatigue or shell shock. Patton, who viewed psychiatric casualties as cowards malingering while better men died at the front, verbally abused Kull, called him a coward, slapped him across the face with his gloves, and threatened to have him shot for cowardice in the face of the enemy. 1 week later, on August 10, Patton repeated this behavior at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, where he encountered Private Paul Bennett, another psychiatric casualty, and in front of shocked medical staff, Patton slapped Bennett, drew his ivory-handled pistol, and threatened to execute him on the spot before being physically restrained by medical officers. These incidents, which became known as the slapping incidents, were initially covered up by war correspondents who had accompanied Patton throughout the Sicily campaign and respected his military achievements, but by November 1943, the story had reached the United States through columnist Drew Pearson, igniting a firestorm of public outrage and calls for Patton's immediate dismissal. Eisenhower now faced an impossible dilemma that would test every ounce of his political skill and strategic judgment, because firing Patton would appease public opinion and maintain military discipline, but it would also deprive the Allied forces of their most aggressive and successful field commander at precisely the moment when the invasion of France was being planned. The German High Command considered Patton the most dangerous Allied general, the one commander they genuinely feared, and Eisenhower knew that Patton's ability to drive armored forces deep into enemy territory and his willingness to take risks that more cautious commanders would avoid made him irreplaceable for the kind of war that lay ahead. Eisenhower's solution was characteristically political and strategically brilliant, choosing to sideline Patton temporarily, requiring him to make public apologies to the soldiers he had struck and to the entire 7th Army, while secretly planning to use Patton as the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the invasion of France would come at Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. By placing Patton in command of the fictional 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, which existed only in radio transmissions, fake equipment displays, and German intelligence reports, Eisenhower turned his most problematic general into his most valuable strategic asset, because the Germans believed that no invasion would begin without Patton leading it, and therefore concentrated their reserves away from the actual landing sites in Normandy. This decision, to neither fully punish nor fully vindicate Patton, became emblematic of Eisenhower's management style throughout the war, a constant balancing act between military effectiveness and political acceptability, between leveraging Patton's undeniable talents and containing his equally undeniable capacity for catastrophic judgment errors. Patton, for his part, never fully understood or accepted the constraints that Eisenhower faced as supreme commander, viewing political considerations as beneath the dignity of warriors and seeing Eisenhower's careful diplomacy as weakness rather than strength. In his personal diary, which would later be published and cause yet another controversy, Patton wrote bitterly about being crucified for disciplining cowards while politicians and staff officers who have never heard a shot fired in anger sat in judgment of him. The fundamental tension in their relationship was becoming clear, that Patton saw war as an arena for individual heroism and glory, while Eisenhower understood it as a massive organizational challenge requiring coordination among millions of people, dozens of nations, and countless competing interests and objectives. This philosophical divide would only deepen as the war in Europe intensified and the opportunities for Patton to challenge Eisenhower's authority multiplied with each new campaign and each new controversy. The slapping incidents had been survived, barely, but they were merely the opening act in a drama that would play out across the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Germany over the next 18 months, with increasingly higher stakes and increasingly dangerous consequences. The relationship reached another critical breaking point in September 1944, during the race across France following the breakout from Normandy, when Patton's Third Army was advancing so rapidly that it threatened to outrun its supply lines and create exactly the kind of strategic chaos that Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, was desperately trying to avoid. By late August 1944, Patton's armored spearheads had crossed the Seine River and were driving toward the German border at a pace that astonished both Allied planners and German defenders, capturing thousands of prisoners and liberating French territory at a rate of 30 to 40 miles per day. Patton became convinced, and argued vociferously to anyone who would listen, that if Eisenhower would simply give him priority for fuel, ammunition, and supplies, he could drive straight to the Rhine River, cross into Germany proper, and potentially end the war before Christmas 1944. Eisenhower, however, was operating under constraints that Patton either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge, because the Allied supply situation in September 1944 was precarious in the extreme, with virtually everything still being landed over the Normandy beaches or through the port of Cherbourg, then trucked hundreds of miles to the advancing armies in a massive logistics operation called the Red Ball Express. The port of Antwerp had been captured largely intact on September 4th, but its approaches through the Scheldt estuary remained in German hands, meaning the Allies' most important potential supply port couldn't actually be used until those approaches were cleared. Eisenhower made the strategic decision to adopt what he called the broad front strategy, advancing into Germany on multiple axes rather than concentrating everything behind a single thrust, which infuriated Patton and also frustrated British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was advocating for his own concentrated thrust through the Netherlands and into the Ruhr industrial region. On September 16th, Patton was summoned to a heated meeting at Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles, where he demanded priority of supplies and accused Eisenhower of letting political considerations, specifically the need to keep Montgomery and the British happy, override sound military judgment. The argument became so intense that Patton later wrote in his diary that he had to restrain himself from physically attacking his supreme commander, writing that Eisenhower's caution and political maneuvering were prolonging the war and costing American lives unnecessarily. Right at this pivotal moment in our story, when Patton and Eisenhower's strategic disagreement threatened to fracture the Allied command structure, take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Smash that like button to help others discover these incredible true stories of wartime leadership. And make sure you share this video with anyone fascinated by military history or the psychology of command under pressure. Leave us a comment telling us whether you think Patton was right about the single-thrust strategy or whether Eisenhower's broad front approach was the wiser choice, because this debate has fascinated military historians for 8 decades and we want to hear your perspective on one of World War II's greatest strategic controversies. Eisenhower's decision to maintain the broad front strategy, denying Patton the supplies he demanded for a dash to the Rhine, proved controversial both at the time and in historical retrospect, with serious military analysts arguing both sides of this question for generations afterward. Patton believed, with considerable justification, that the German army in the West was in complete disarray in September 1944, having lost perhaps 400,000 men in France, and that a concentrated thrust by his Third Army could have reached the Rhine and possibly crossed it before German defenses could be reorganized. Eisenhower's counterargument, equally valid, was that such a thrust would create an impossibly long and vulnerable supply line, that the German army still possessed significant reserves and the capacity to counterattack exposed flanks, and that the political and strategic imperative to keep the Allied coalition unified required sharing the glory and the resources among American, British, and other Allied forces. The result of this strategic disagreement was that Patton's advance slowed dramatically in late September and October 1944, as fuel shortages literally stopped his tanks in their tracks, while Montgomery's ambitious Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault designed to capture bridges across the Rhine through the Netherlands, ended in costly failure at Arnhem between September 17 and 25. Patton viewed this outcome as vindication of his position, believing that the resources wasted on Market Garden could have fueled his drive into Germany, and his resentment toward Eisenhower deepened into something approaching contempt, at least in the privacy of his diary and in conversations with his staff officers. The pattern was now firmly established, with Patton achieving brilliant tactical successes on the battlefield while simultaneously creating political and strategic headaches for Eisenhower through his public statements, his diary entries that were shared too freely, and his apparent inability or unwillingness to understand the larger strategic and political context within which Eisenhower had to operate. In October 1944, Patton gave an off-the-record speech to a women's club in England in which he made remarks about post-war Anglo-American relations that omitted any mention of the Soviet Union, creating a diplomatic incident at precisely the moment when Allied unity was essential and when Stalin was already suspicious of Western intentions. Once again, Eisenhower was forced to reprimand Patton, and once again, he stopped short of the relief from command that many in Washington were demanding, because the simple military reality was that Patton delivered results on the battlefield that no other American commander could match, and Eisenhower needed those results to win the war. The Third Army's record spoke for itself, having advanced farther, faster, and with fewer casualties relative to enemy losses than any other Allied army in Western Europe, liberating thousands of square miles of French territory and destroying multiple German divisions in the process. Eisenhower understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the Allied command structure, that Patton's genius and Patton's madness were inseparable, that you couldn't have the brilliant armored commander who terrified the Germans without also accepting the impulsive, politically tone-deaf egotist who created constant crises for his superiors. This understanding required Eisenhower to develop an almost superhuman patience and a sophisticated management approach that combined public reprimands with private protection, maintaining discipline and military order while preserving Patton's effectiveness as a combat leader. The challenge was that Patton seemed constitutionally incapable of learning from these episodes, viewing each reprimand not as a justified consequence of his actions but as evidence of Eisenhower's weakness and political corruption, as proof that his old friend had been transformed by high command into just another staff officer more concerned with pleasing politicians than with winning battles and destroying the enemy. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought yet another crisis in the Eisenhower-Patton relationship, this time emerging from the massive German counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944, and caught Allied intelligence and command completely by surprise. When Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to an emergency conference in Verdun on December 19, with German panzer divisions driving deep into American lines and threatening to split the Allied forces in two, Patton arrived in a characteristic mood of aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance. While other commanders were still assessing the situation and trying to understand the scope of the German attack, Patton announced that he could disengage 3 divisions from his current operations around Saarbrücken, with them 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration within 48 hours, a promise that seemed logistically impossible to everyone in the room except Patton himself. Eisenhower, desperate for any way to blunt the German offensive and relieve the surrounded American forces in Bastogne, authorized Patton's counterattack despite skepticism from other commanders who thought Patton was overpromising and that his attack would arrive too late or with insufficient force to make a difference. Patton delivered on his promise with characteristic brilliance, moving the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division north through ice, snow, and some of the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades, attacking into the southern shoulder of the Bulge on December 22, exactly when he said he would. The relief of Bastogne by elements of Patton's Third Army on December 26 became one of the legendary achievements of American military history, demonstrating Patton's extraordinary ability to conduct complex operations at high speed under desperate circumstances, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Patton's battlefield success might finally overcome the accumulated weight of his political disasters and personal controversies. Eisenhower, in a rare moment of unqualified praise, called Patton's performance during the Battle of the Bulge one of the most brilliant feats of the war, recognition that meant more to Patton than perhaps any other acknowledgement he received during his military career. But even this triumph couldn't prevent the next confrontation, because Patton's approach to the Battle of the Bulge revealed fundamental strategic differences that would plague the Eisenhower-Patton relationship through the final months of the war in Europe. Once Patton had relieved Bastogne and blunted the German offensive, Eisenhower wanted him to continue attacking north to link up with American and British forces attacking from the north, essentially cutting off and destroying the German forces in the Ardennes salient in a massive encirclement. Patton, however, wanted to continue attacking east toward the Rhine, arguing that destroying the Bulge was less important than maintaining offensive momentum into Germany proper and that trying to trap the Germans in the Ardennes would only allow them to conduct an orderly withdrawal while American forces wasted time and resources on a battle of annihilation that would never materialize. The argument that ensued, conducted through a series of heated phone calls and tense meetings in January 1945, encapsulated everything that made the Eisenhower-Patton relationship so volatile and so essential to Allied victory, because both men were right from their respective positions and both were wrong in their assessment of what the other could and should do. Eisenhower, operating at the strategic level, needed to destroy German combat power and create conditions for the final drive into Germany by eliminating enemy forces west of the Rhine, which meant methodical, coordinated operations by all Allied armies advancing together. Patton, operating at the operational level, saw opportunities to exploit German weaknesses, penetrate their defenses, and create the kind of fluid, mobile warfare in which American armor and air power had decisive advantages over a German army that was running out of fuel, ammunition, and trained replacements. The compromise that emerged satisfied neither man, with Patton ordered to continue attacking north while also preparing for eventual operations toward the Rhine, a split mission that diluted his forces and prevented the kind of concentrated thrust that he believed could have achieved decisive results. By February 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge concluded and Allied forces prepared for the final campaigns to cross the Rhine and invade Germany proper, the Eisenhower-Patton relationship had settled into a pattern of mutual dependence and mutual frustration that would characterize the final months of the war in Europe. The most dangerous confrontation between Eisenhower and Patton came not during active combat operations but in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, when Patton's political views and his public statements about the defeated Nazi regime created a crisis that finally exceeded even Eisenhower's considerable tolerance and political skill. In the spring and summer of 1945, as Allied forces occupied Germany and began the process of denazification and military government, Patton was assigned to command the Bavarian region from his headquarters in Bad Tolz, a position that required not just military oversight but political judgment and diplomatic sensitivity, qualities that Patton had never possessed in abundance. Patton's views on the occupation and on the broader question of post-war Germany were shaped by his growing conviction that the Soviet Union, not defeated Germany, represented the real threat to American interests. And he began making statements to journalists and in public settings that suggested former Nazi Party members should be quickly rehabilitated and incorporated into a rebuilt German state that could serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. At a press conference on September 22, 1945, Patton compared Nazi Party membership to Democratic or Republican Party membership in the United States, suggesting that most Germans had joined the party for practical rather than ideological reasons and should not be held accountable for the regime's crimes. This statement, made at a time when the full horrors of the Holocaust were being documented and when Allied policy was firmly committed to denazification and the prosecution of war criminals, created an immediate firestorm of criticism in the American press and in Washington, with prominent politicians and editorial writers demanding Patton's immediate relief from command. Eisenhower, now serving as the overall commander of American occupation forces in Germany and increasingly focused on transitioning from military leadership to what would eventually become his role as Army Chief of Staff and later President of the United States, could no longer protect Patton from the consequences of his statements and actions. On October 7, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, transferring him to command of the 15th Army, essentially a paper headquarters responsible for compiling records and writing the official history of the European campaign, a humiliating demotion for a man who had commanded armies in combat and who believed himself destined for historical greatness. The final chapter in the Eisenhower-Patton relationship was written not on the battlefield but in a series of private conversations and letters in the autumn of 1945, as both men grappled with the end of their wartime partnership and the radically different futures that awaited them in the post-war world. Patton, bitter and increasingly isolated, wrote in his diary that Eisenhower had sold out to politicians and that their friendship had been destroyed by Eisenhower's ambition and his unwillingness to stand up for a subordinate who had delivered victory after victory on the battlefield. Eisenhower, for his part, tried to make Patton understand that the world had changed, that the political and moral questions raised by Nazi Germany and the Holocaust could not be dismissed or minimized, and that military commanders in a democracy were accountable not just to military efficiency but to political leadership and public opinion. Their final meeting, in early December 1945, was cordial but distant, with both men understanding that whatever bond had once connected them had been irreparably broken by the pressures of war, command, and their fundamentally different understanding of what military leadership required in the modern world. On December 9, 1945, Patton was severely injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, when his staff car collided with an American Army truck, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down with a broken neck and cervical spinal cord injury. Eisenhower rushed to Patton's bedside at the military hospital in Heidelberg, and the two men spoke privately for the last time, a conversation whose contents have never been fully disclosed but which both men's biographers describe as emotional and reconciliatory, a final moment of connection between two men whose relationship had shaped the course of the war in Europe. Patton died on December 21, 1945, from a pulmonary embolism related to his injuries, and Eisenhower served as one of his pallbearers, walking behind the flag-draped coffin of the man who had been simultaneously his most effective subordinate and his most persistent challenge throughout the greatest military campaign in American history. In his eulogy and in later reflections, Eisenhower would describe Patton as a military genius whose flaws were inseparable from his strengths, a man born for war but unable to adapt to peace, someone whose place in history was secure despite or perhaps because of his spectacular capacity for self-destruction and confrontation with authority. The story of when Patton challenged Eisenhower's authority in the heat of war is ultimately a story about leadership under impossible pressure, about the tension between military effectiveness and political accountability, and about two men whose partnership was essential to Allied victory despite being fundamentally unsustainable as a long-term relationship. If this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating command relationships has given you new insight into the human dynamics that shaped history's greatest conflict, do us a favor and subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button so more people can discover these stories, and share this video with anyone who loves military history or leadership studies, because these lessons about managing brilliant but difficult people remain relevant in every field and every era. Drop a comment telling us what aspect of the Eisenhower-Patton relationship you found most surprising or what historical detail you learned today that you didn't know before, because understanding how these two men navigated their volatile partnership offers profound insights into leadership, command, and the human dimensions of warfare that no amount of studying tactics and strategy alone can provide. Eisenhower went on to become Army Chief of Staff, President of Columbia University, Supreme Commander of NATO, and eventually a two-term President of the United States, a career trajectory that vindicated his political skills and his understanding that military leadership in a democracy requires diplomatic finesse and coalition building as much as battlefield brilliance. Patton's legacy, frozen forever at the moment of his death at age 60, remains that of the pure warrior, the aggressive combat leader who inspired his troops, terrified his enemies, and drove himself and everyone around him toward victory regardless of personal cost or political consequence. A man whose genius was inseparable from his demons and whose place in American military mythology is secure precisely because he represents something that modern military leadership has largely evolved beyond. The tension between these two models of leadership, between Eisenhower's careful management and Patton's reckless brilliance, continues to inform debates about military effectiveness, civil-military relations, and the qualities required for success in warfare, making their wartime confrontations relevant not just as historical curiosities but as case studies in leadership that remain valuable 8 decades after the events themselves.